Do you enjoy a good kitchen fail? Because I do, and I've got a good one for you today. Welcome back to the Casual Ethnographer. In February of 2024, I decided that I wanted to make my own sourdough starter because I was eating gluten-free and I wasn't finding a reasonably priced gluten-free bread in the grocery store. I named her Gertrude and she did very well. I made many loaves off of Gertrude for myself and for my sister-in-law. And then over time, my body decided that it didn't like rice anymore. So much so that I now carry an EpiPen in case I'm exposed to it. So whatever I couldn't give away of Gertrude, I threw away. And no bread for a while, and then I decided in April that I wanted to give grain-free sourdough a try. So I got some ingredients based off of research, and I started Bertha on April 14th. The process went well. It wasn't that much different from starting Gertrude. I did kickstart it ever so slightly with just a few granules of commercially available dried yeast. The rapid rise instant yeast that I use in the gluten recipes I make for my family. So she got off to a great start. Things were going well. So on Monday, Cinco de Mayo, so May 5th, she hit 3 weeks and I was ready to try making bread with her. So Monday morning I got up and I got Bertha ready by feeding her. I used cassava flour and sweet potato flour. Gave her a good stir. I started to put the flour in, and then I realized that I forgot to take some discard out, to make room for her to rise. So you'll see me stop for just a moment, pull the flour over to the side, and go grab a dish. I set the food scale to 0, and I pulled out 240 grams, which is, in my experience, what measures out to be 1 cup of discard. With the discard out of the way, I was able to resume feeding. I find it's easier to mix the flours in first and then the liquid. Sometimes, though, it becomes too thick, so I'll add a little bit of flour and then a little bit of liquid. Just depends on what Bertha is doing. So here I'm adding little bits of water, stirring, looking for a consistency that is not too thick, not too thin, sort of like pancake batter, maybe slightly thinner than pancake batter. In the sourdough culture, from me watching videos and reading on Reddit, I have noticed that a lot of bread makers like their dough to be, or their starter to be, thicker. But these are all folks that work with gluten flour. My personal experience is that the grain-free flours need more hydration. So I cleaned up the edges of the jar and got Bertha covered back up. Then I moved the tape so I would know how much rising Bertha did and set her off to the side so that she could grow to make bread with her later in the day. And I used I used the recipe that I had used for my gluten-free dough, and things were going well, I thought. Because I was basing this recipe off of a former gluten-free sourdough bread recipe, I started with 440 grams, measured on a food scale, of flour. I ran out of cassava flour. I put everything I had in there, which was a lot, and then I had to add additional other grain-free flours to meet that 440 grams. Some of those flours included sweet potato flour, buckwheat flour. I honestly can't remember what all flours I put in there. But then next I added 15 grams of xanthan gum. That was an increase compared to the other recipe because the old gluten-free flour I was using had xanthan gum in it. And then 15 grams of salt. I was out of sea salt, so I just used the regular salt that was in my cupboard. Next up came 220 grams of the sourdough starter, followed by 10 grams of olive oil. I weighed out 360 grams of filtered water, mixed together my starter and oil, and made sure before I added the water that it was 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Until I mixed the wet with the dry. And then I realized that cassava flour responds differently to the mixture than the Bob's Red Mill 1-to-1 gluten-free flour that I was using in my other recipe. If that's a recipe that you would be interested in, I'm more than happy to share it. But let me show you some pictures of what the process looked like. When I realized that it needed more hydration, I added 50% more of the starter oil and water, mixed it together, but it was still too dry. So I added another 50% of each of those. So ultimately, to get the dough hydrated, I had to add double the amount of wet ingredients. So by the time I was done mixing everything together, I had about double the dough that I had planned for. So I let it ferment, as they call it, on the counter for several hours, and then I put it in the refrigerator to deal with the next morning. And it did rise. Now, a grain-free dough is not going to rise to the same degree as a glutened dough, so I didn't have any grand expectations, but it did rise. But I had a different problem. I now had double the dough that I had to do something with. And I knew that I wanted to experiment with cooking times. So here's what I did. So in the morning when I took Bertha out of the refrigerator, I set her on the counter and removed the plastic. My goal was to portion this out into 3 sections so that I would have a half to freeze, a quarter to cook at one amount of time, and another quarter to cook at a lesser amount of time. This is the cutting board that I use exclusively for bread making. This is sweet potato flour that I use to dust the board. I did that mostly because I was out of cassava flour. I kind of formed it into a ball in my hand, and now I'm rolling it around the cutting board to dust the outside. My goal was for it to not be sticky and to try and smooth the surface so that it would look nice when it baked. Time for the second quarter. I dusted the board again with sweet potato flour. And did the same thing with the second quarter that I did with the first quarter. rolling it around in the flour to make it not sticky and smooth out the surface. Then I took my enameled cast iron skillet out of the cupboard, and here I'm showing you I'm separating the two because they are going to go into the oven separate. They go into a cold oven, and the oven is then preheated to 450 degrees. While I was waiting for the oven, I prepared the half portion to be frozen. This is a piece of plastic wrap. I'm going to do it in 2 sections. First, oiling it. I want to make sure it fits in the food storage bag, so I am smushing it around to make sure it is in sort of a rounded rectangular shape. So the first piece of plastic wrap is mostly just to get the dough covered. And then the second piece of plastic wrap will be to make sure that the first piece doesn't come unwrapped as I slide it into the food storage bag. Here I am labeling the food storage bag that this is grain-free sourdough and with a date. Now it is time to prepare the rounds for the oven. I am oiling with avocado oil a paring knife, and I will be scoring the top of each of these rounds of bread differently so that I can tell them apart. The one that receives a grid pattern will bake 10 minutes longer than the other round. Also, the grid one, since I put in first, it will have less time relaxing on the counter after being in the refrigerator than the other one. So 2 different experiences. The first one having a longer bake time but a shorter time on the counter, and the other one a shorter bake time but a longer time on the counter. This is parchment paper. For the process that I use, it is vital because since I am preheating the Dutch oven, it is going to be very hot when it comes out to receive the bread. So I set it on the parchment paper because then I can just slide it in without touching the pan other than removing it from the oven. And it will make it easier to slide the next round in. The scores kind of smushed together when I moved it, so I'm just making sure that there is plenty of space for it to expand in the oven. Okay, here is a 450 degree Dutch oven, and I'm going to grab the paper and just slide it in, put the lid on, and it will go into the oven for 45 minutes at 450 degrees. After those 45 minutes, I will take it out, remove the lid, and then reduce the heat to 425 degrees, or it will bake for 35 minutes. While waiting for the first round to cook, I went ahead and grabbed the second round and got it ready on the parchment paper so that I could wash the cutting board. While waiting for the oven to beep, I made myself some hot cocoa. This is dairy-free, and I add protein powder to it. So here is a mug that I'm going to half fill with my favorite almond milk and then microwave it for 1 minute 30 seconds. Then I'll get out the other ingredients: cocoa powder, this is my favorite brand, some chocolate chips, vanilla extract, almond extract, and then my favorite protein powder, which is Bob's Red Mill almond protein powder. Once I got everything out, then the oven beeped and it was time to take the lid off of the bread and reduce the temperature. Now time to make the cocoa. I don't measure anything for this. This is just something I make for me. So everything is going to happen with that spoon and my hand. So first I start with a handful of the chocolate chips and I put them in the warm milk where they will start to melt, and then I will use my teaspoon to just grab a little bit of cocoa powder and a little bit of almond powder, and then comes the extracts. In this case, I didn't catch it on film, but I also added some cinnamon, ground cinnamon, and some ground cayenne. I learned that from a barista many years ago. She called it a Mayan mocha, although in my case I didn't add any coffee to this, so it was just a Mayan hot chocolate. And it's super good if you like things a little bit spicy. I don't tend to like a lot of sugar in my hot cocoa, so you'll notice I didn't add any sugar. So whatever sugar naturally exists in that milk and in the chocolate chips is it. I did blend it up with a milk frother. And I brought my tea kettle full of boiling water over because I will top it off with that. I find if I top it off with the almond milk, it's too rich for me, so the water is perfect. Time to take the first loaf out of the oven. I like to put any hot things on these little cork boards on the counter. And now that needs to go back in the oven, warm back up to 450 degrees. Then I slid the second round in. The second round is going to bake for, this time 40 minutes at 450 degrees. And then for 30 minutes at 425 degrees. As you can see, the first round is quite a bit darker than the second round. So at initial review, I thought that they both turned out well, and I didn't know if one was going to be overcooked or undercooked.
So the real question is, was it a failure? Yes and no. The bread did bubble up and rise. It did form into a loaf or a round, and it did cook. So it did all of the things that it was supposed to do with that respect. But it's still gummy in the middle. It is undercooked in the middle. And could I experiment with a longer cook time? Yeah, I plan to, because I still have that other half in my freezer. So at some point I will pull that out, split that into two, and make 2 rounds and try cooking 1 loaf or 1 round
10 minutes longer than the longer cooking time of the two that I did yesterday. And then I will cook the other one 10 minutes longer than that. So we'll see. We'll have four experiments cooking times. And I've also never frozen my own dough before. Have I bought frozen dough from the grocery store? Yes, I've bought some really good frozen rolls from the grocery store. But I've never frozen my own dough. So it'll be a couple different experiments. We'll get to see what the cooking times change, how the cooking times change, and then also how freezing the dough, if that makes any sort of impact. But I think before I do that, I want to give a try to adding baking powder. I did a little Googling, internet search last night, and the purists, yes, sourdough cooking is its own culture. So the purists, bless them, they don't believe that sourdough bread should have anything but your starter, flour, and water, and salt. But the baking powder, I think, in this circumstance is warranted because there's no gluten, and there's not even other grains in it. So I'll give that a try. I'll make that a separate episode, and we will see if that is a fail or not. Ultimately, my goal is to make a bread that I can eat. I want to be able to have a sandwich. I want to be able to have toast. I want to be able to have croutons on a salad. Nothing crazy at all. So Bertha, as she exists right now, she is hanging out in the fridge. On Monday, it'll be a week since I have mixed any bread. I will take her out of the fridge, and I will make a determination as to if I just feed her and put her back, or if I do something with her at that time. But with sourdough starters, from my experience, they do just fine with a weekly feeding, provided that you put them in the fridge in between. So if that is something that you choose to do, you would take her out of the fridge, let your sourdough starter relax, warm up a little bit on the counter. I like to do it for a few hours, and then feed your starter, and then let them react, bubble up, do their thing. And then once they die down and they're starting to relax again, then you put them back in the fridge. When my starter is sitting on the counter, I leave it with the single ply paper towel over the top with a rubber band. When it's in the fridge, I go ahead and put the cap on it that came with the jar. I just don't tighten it all the way down because sourdough starters are alive and they do need to breathe. But you don't want it all the way open so that it dries out. So just something to consider. Keep in mind that because it is gluten-free and not, say, a rye flour or a wheat flour, it is going to be denser. It is going to be a denser bread. That is just the nature of it. So one of the probably most important lessons that I learned from this is Bertha probably wasn't ready. But the second most important lesson was that cassava flour, I probably only needed to use half of what I used. The baking that I've done so far with cassava flour, I've always mixed it with other grain-free flours, and so it hasn't had to stand on its own. Not that it did in this bread either, but it provided the bulk of the flours used in this first bread. Whereas in a cake recipe or a muffin recipe, coffee cake, what else have I done with it? A few different things. I have mixed it with other flours, so it's maybe taken quarter to a third of the overall space, and it's also been much smaller amounts. We're talking like half a cup, quarter cup, maybe at the most a full cup, depending upon the size of what I was working with. So Bertha needs to mature a little bit more, and the cassava flour I will, when I do the next trial, I will use half the amount of flour, but keep the amount of starter and oil and water the same. And we'll see how that goes. And add the baking powder. So those are the lessons that I learned from this birthday experiment. I made a modified version of a Great Depression era recipe called Wacky Cake that I got from my grandmother. And this is the equipment you will need: a 9 by 9 inch square glass baking dish and a spoon. I used 4 flours: the buckwheat flour, potato flour, cassava flour, and coconut flour. The other dry ingredients are cocoa powder, salt, grain-free baking powder, baking soda, and sugar. The measurements come out to 1/4 cup each of the flours and cocoa powder, 1 cup of sugar, 1 teaspoon each of baking soda and salt, and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Mix together and make 3 wells for the liquids. And then we move on to wet ingredients: 5 tablespoons of avocado oil, 1 teaspoon each of vanilla and apple cider vinegar, and then a 1/2 cup of warm water. Mix together until combined and bake in a 350-degree oven for 40 minutes. Allow to cool for several hours before cutting into it. That evening, I cut myself a little square, and because I hadn't made any other frosting, I mixed up a quick icing using this cornstarch-free powdered sugar. This is everything I put in my icing. I start off with a couple of spoonfuls of the powdered sugar, a 1/2 spoonful of cocoa powder, mixed that together a little bit, added a splash of vanilla, and then just a little bit of almond milk. You don't want to overdo it or else it becomes too runny. You can always add more. You can't take any away. And here is the final result, which I had with a cup of decaffeinated tea. Okay. Well, as you can see, there are still bubbles. So it did rise. It just doesn't feel like it. Like every piece of this, I'm gonna have to toast to make it edible. The piece that I had last night, I sliced off the edge, and it was a little on the gummy side. I put some butter on it. It seemed fine. But then I sliced the second slice. It was thinner than this one. I was like, oh no. So I put both in the fridge because since they're homemade breads, they don't have preservatives. They will go bad faster. I thought I would check them this morning. So are they edible? Sure. Could I do better? Yes. And I think I have a solution. But let me show you something real quick. This is the cake that I made from the sourdough starter. Can't remember now, a couple days ago. And I want to show you how it doesn't have this issue. It's not, I took this directly from the center of the cake. So you can see it's not sticky. So the main difference between the two is I used additional leavening agents with this. So I'm just gonna break it in half so you can see it's soft, it's crumbly, it still holds together, but it's not doughy, it's not sticky. So I have found when I bake grain-free, I have to use twice as much baking powder as a normal recipe would call for. So in this particular recipe, it called for 1 teaspoon. I use 2 teaspoons, and I do use a special baking powder that is corn-free. And there's also some baking soda in it, just 1 teaspoon. But the part that I keep laughing at myself for is because I made so much dough, I still have this much dough sitting in my freezer. So I'm not sure, maybe I make flatbread with that. because then it would have more contact with the heating surface. If you enjoyed watching my grain-free sourdough face plant, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you have any tips or tricks for bakers such as myself or those watching, please drop those in the comments. I post new episodes on Mondays and Thursdays. As always, thank you for being here. I appreciate your presence. See you next time.